Our Society's leader, Bart Worden, will be speaking today. In addition to his work as the clergy leader for this ethical society, Bart is also the executive director for our parent organization, the American Ethical Union. Prior to his training for ethical culture leadership, Bart worked as a social worker in a number of settings, working primarily with programs that help people recover from psychiatric disabilities. In his role as executive director for the American Ethical Union, Bart has been learning about fundraising and has been getting practiced in the arts of asking people for money. If you would like to further his education in these matters, please give him a call. He'd love to hear from you. Today's address is titled, A Sermon on the Amount. What does it mean to give generously? Please welcome Bart to the podium.
So, first of all, you may notice that I'm well prepared for this address. I'm wearing green. I have a green tie, green jacket, green pants, and if you could see some other things I was wearing, you'd notice they were green as well. I felt I really needed to get myself into the role because I'm more than usually nervous with this kind of address. But one of the hats that I do wear as executive director is as the fundraiser, which is a subset of my role doing other kind of things. And this is relatively new for me. I often find myself on the lower portion of the learning curve on this matter, and so it does make a big difference to me that I have the opportunity to have conversations with people about raising money and also have conversations with people that give money to learn more about what inspires people to do that and what are the kind of things that we could talk about that would be helpful for their giving and for our receiving. So as the American Ethical Union. The thing is, I did not seek out the fundraiser role. When I made a proposal for what I could do as executive director, I listed 6 items that I thought would be really important things to do, and fundraising was not one of the 6. And there's a reason for that. First of all, how many people in the room really enjoy asking people for money? Do we have a show of hands? Aha, okay, I'm speaking to the choir. I like that. So, years ago, I was in graduate school for social work. And in one of the major parts of the training program is having people learn how to do social work interviewing, right? So interviewing is a matter of, starting where the person is and helping the person talk about their lives and their concerns and that sort of thing. And there's a real art to it. And my practice professor said, the thing is, there is one topic that is particularly dangerous to bring up, and I'd like to talk about that today. And so our minds go to the usual suspects, right? Religion, politics, sex. But that's not what she had in mind at all. She says the thing that is most likely to be troublesome is asking people about money and finances. There is more domestic discord and more other kinds of problems and arguments and things that come up around money than anything else. So in fact, if you want to learn more about a person's sex life, you might intimate that you're about to talk about money, and then they may start giving you a lot more information just to kind of delay the rest of the conversation. So that I come to talking about money with a fair amount of nervousness, and also I'm just aware that it is kind of a taboo topic in this country. And probably other places as well, right? We like to talk about what other people do with money, a little bit less talk about what we're doing with our money and that sort of thing. So, with money being a hot topic, I thought it might be a good idea to kind of look at money just a little bit more in terms of a point of view. And this may not be a point of view that people share, I'm not too sure. But it's this. I actually don't believe in money. I think money is kind of an imaginary thing that people just kind of threw together, kind of on a whim in many respects, and have kind of keep going at it. But if you really think about it, money it doesn't really have a lot of real substance in and of itself, right? I mean, you can have a $100 bill in your hand, but it's really just a piece of paper. Right? And not that dissimilar from all the series of ones and zeros that are going back and forth with all the financial accounts across the universe. It's something that we've kind of made up, and it's something that we kind of put our time and attention to, not because it's something necessarily real per se, but because there's something that we do with it. All right? But again, it's more of a work of the imagination than it is a work of the actual, right? And why is that important? Well, one reason it's important is because people have the fiction that they own things, right? That they have money that they own, that they have real estate that they own, that they have accounts that they've invested in, so those investments are theirs. But ownership is as much a fiction as money is, right? In other words, ownership is a matter of people's agreeing that you are controlling it. And that can change. That can change quickly. In recent years, there's been lots of tax revolt. People really not liking the idea of paying taxes. And I think one of the bases for that is people's kind of almost understanding that what they have is vulnerable, right? What they have can be taken by others. And that calls into question whether they truly have it, or if there's some level of worry that they might want to have about whether this is stable or not. Now, for hundreds of years, we've had these financial things in place that are, in fact, propping up people's being able to hold on to money, right, and to be able to control its usage, at least in many places. But there's real variety, right? So there's hundreds of millions of people that are currently subsisting at less than $1.90 per day, right? Hundreds of millions of people. On the other extreme, in the United States, there's maybe some 14,000 families that are on the 100th percentile of earners, which would mean making, where is it now? Something like $22,795 per day to get into that club. $22,795 per day to be part of that 100th percentile of earners in the United States. So we have these extremes, right? And in between the extremes, of course, are all the percentiles. But it calls to question, what are these extremes about, right? What do they mean? And what does it say about us as a people that we have them? So that's how we get to the generosity piece. One thing to be aware of, I believe, is that the financial standing of any particular person is most likely closest related to the financial standing of their previous ancestors. Right? In other words, the lion's share of the money that households have at this point is in some way, shape, or form brought down through generations. Right? That's particularly true in real estate, but I think it's also true in a lot of other accounts and things along those lines. And the opposite end of that is, if you wind up being within a system that doesn't get to turn over much to the people beneath, you wind up having this growing system, right, where you have a lot of people that have a fair amount of money and they can kind of pass it along to generations, and a lot of people, and maybe even more people, I don't know the numbers so well, that really don't have that even as a possibility. Right? Now, in this country, that inequity is pretty strongly associated with enslavement. Right? So when you think about, okay, the money that has been kind of propping up your particular thing comes from your ancestors, from the ancestors, et cetera. Well, where did they get their capital? Right? Well, in the United States, in the 19th century, a lot of that capital was coming from the buying and selling of people for enslavement purposes. And then a lot of other money was on the basis of the work of those enslaved people, who were not getting compensated, I might add, generating cotton, which is, I believe, the biggest exporter of the United States during the 19th century. And those raw materials were then being utilized in the manufacturing industry to make even more money. Right? So you may think, well, it's just a problem for the South because that's where the enslavement was. But the fact is the North was capitalizing on this quite handily as well. And so a lot of what you have as the money that people have access to, you could probably pretty fairly look at as the spoils of theft, enslavement, kidnapping, murder, all those kind of things, right? So historically, we've done a number of things in our country that have led to having a fair number of people have significant resources available to them, but there are really strong questions that we can ask about, was that fairly arrived at? And does that mean that people should still have full control over what they have been able to get access to? All right? So think about it this way. Let's say somebody comes to your house and you just happen to be having a lot of money in a mattress instead of in a bank account because you don't trust bank accounts. They don't give much interest anyway. And they steal your mattress and they steal, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 out of your house. And then they have it. So if possession is in fact 9/10 of the law and they have your mattress, is it fair to say that they owe you anything back if they are successful in controlling it? Right? I mean, most of us would think, if somebody took stuff out of my house, they would need to pay it back. I'd send the police after them or whatever else. But looking at our own history, where we have been the recipients of theft and kidnapping and those kinds of things, are we on firm moral ground to demand it back? I think it's a reasonable question to ask ourselves. Scary, bad. So anyway, thinking at it this way, generosity starts to take on a new flavor, doesn't it? Because how do you really think about being generous with stuff that you kind of have loose control over in some respects, or you manage to get hold of because, through somebody else's work and that sort of thing. So how do you figure out generosity? So I went back to look up the definition of generosity, and one of the things that was telling for me is how relative the term is for people, right? So generosity is about giving more than it's expected. It's basically the way it's typically looked at in the dictionary definitions, right? So it's really relative to what the people around you are doing. Which brings us to being here in an ethical society. You have people around you, and we're all trying to figure out, well, how are we to live our lives in such a way that what we do, what we contribute to the life around us, helps move the world to a better place, right? A place that has more equity in it, a place that has more compassion in it. What are the kind of things that we can do that will help in that direction? And we can look to see our performance comparing ourselves to other people, right? In other words, if generosity is a relative term based on how you do in accordance with expectations, it probably makes sense then for us to look at, how do people typically give? And then we can ask ourselves, are we being more generous or less generous than is typical for people in my standing? All right, with me so far in terms of this? So how are we doing as givers? Well, for charitable giving, individual gifts is the single largest portion of what is raised by fundraisers, right? Individual gifts is the biggest bit. And it varies quite a lot. And so they keep looking at, okay, who are the people that give and how much do they give and that sort of thing. And there's, where was this piece now? So National Philanthropic Trust did a study. All right, so in 2016, the largest charitable giving came from individuals, $281.86 billion of personal giving. That's 72%. And foundations gave closer to 60 billion, and bequests like 30 billion. Corporations much less, 18.5 billion. Anyway, the majority of the charitable dollars went to people's religious organizations, 32%. Right? That's a lot. So think about it in terms of this overall picture here. You have a lot of people giving money. A lot of people are giving money to their religious organizations, right? And that continues, maybe not quite as strong as it was. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. In Christian churches, they often have what's called stewardship, Anyone familiar? I grew up in a Christian church, so I'm familiar with it. Anyway, my friend was the stewardship coordinator or counselor or something like that for his congregation, which meant that he was the one having interviews with people about their charitable giving to the church, and also would know what actually came in. And we were having this conversation, and he says, I've been doing this for several years, and now with the recession, because this was like 2010, we really have many fewer $500 a month givers. And I got thinking, wow, $500 a month givers, lots of them. That would make a difference, wouldn't it, if we had a lot of $500+ a month givers in a group, because that would give you a very good sense of capital. But in fact, that was not uncommon within his congregation. Right? Now, of course, they had a range, right? And I'm sure their median was considerably lower than that. Right? And in fact, when you look at congregational giving, oftentimes they do encourage you to be aware that you have variation. And so a helpful thing is to look at your population's income levels so you have a better handle on where things are out of the median and where you have bulges that have more or less. Because quite frankly, when you're in a community, you're going to have people in it, some of whom have more capacity to give more cash, and others who have less. And it's not really fair to treat everyone the same way, right? In other words, because the person has less, does that mean that the congregation gives them less services or involves them less in their activities, et cetera, right? The concept of congregations is really pretty egalitarian in the sense of what happens for you as your experience as part of it. But the flip side of that is, if you're going to have really great experiences with your congregation, it probably does take a fair amount of funds. And if you have variation in terms of what people have the capacity to do in terms of their giving, it makes sense to have conversations with the people who can be larger donors to talk about doing a fair share. Right? It makes sense to talk about everyone with a fair share, but to kind of underline the fair share necessity for the congregation, for the folks who are in better financial positions. One of the reasons I say that is because when they look at actual giving, what they find is that the people on the lowest percentile, those people, families making under $25,000 a year, when they do contribute, actually are the most generous contributors. Right? Where we go. So oftentimes contributing 12% of their income to the charitable things that they contribute to. All right? And the next most generous group are those folks the families making under $50,000 a year. Right? That's the next most generous. And those folks, when they give like about 5% on average of their annual income. Right? 5%. So you might notice that that's quite a bit less than the poorest people. And as you go up, you'll notice that, in fact, the percentages go down, right? So when, in fact, people have more capacity to give, they also have a lot more funds. And so get the idea that when they're giving large amounts of money, that it is actually a larger chunk for them. But in the reality, it really is not. Actually, one of my conversations was with one of the larger donors for the American Ethical Union, has been a regular giver for years and is happy enough to have personal conversations. And so she was taking me to task about the letter that I'd sent to her. She says, "You can stop thanking me for being so generous." I'm really not. I'm really not. You don't know whether I'm being generous or not because you really have no idea what I have and what I'm prepared to give. Right? And that's especially true of these other people that you know even less than me. So stop telling me how generous I am. Right? I think I've left it out of the letter, but I may not. It's hard to give up on that notion, isn't it? You feel so thankful when somebody actually writes you a check that you want to thank them, certainly. And what do you want to thank them for? If you don't use the word generous, why are you thanking them? So there is something for us to be thinking about in terms of, as givers, what does it mean to us when we're giving away, when we're giving something that we have control over to someone else? Now, I like to imagine that we would want to be folks that would be giving away a fair percentage of what we have access to in some kind of way. And I'm not too sure what you would consider a fair percentage in your own particular world. But in looking over my personal finances, I'm kind of at that 5% level right now. And on the one end, it's comfortable for me in that I feel happy enough when I'm writing checks or sending money off that it's going where it's going. But there's still a fair amount of unhappiness for me because I'm aware that it's not the most that could be done. And it's a pretty good distance from the most that can be done. Now, sometimes doing the most that can be done has some bad consequences too. So I do think it's wise to be thinking in terms of how can we address the needs of the world around us in ways that we can live with and that are effective. Right? So in my case, I like to imagine that I'm contributing to different kinds of situations with the understanding that in some places it will be effective in changing one thing, in other places it'll be effective in addressing something else. So for instance, single biggest gift for my family is to the Ethical Society. Well, okay, that fits in with the kind of the standard giving across the world of people giving to their own religious communities. And for us, I think we are aware that we're not just givers to this community, we're receivers as well, right? In other words, when you give to a congregation that you're part of, you're also the beneficiary of the life of that congregation, right? Your friendships, your activities, the things that you get to do together, and its impact on you. And its impact on you and on the potential impact for other people. Right? So for an ethical society, that's particularly important, right? Because we're not organized to be here for ourselves. We're organized to be here for society, or a society for ethical culture, right? So we're here to be organizing ourselves, not because it's going to be miserable for us, but because we have the belief that when we come together, we can help things move in a better direction in the world around us, not just within our own fold, right? So there is that extra piece that comes with it. So when we are thinking, my family, when I'm thinking about contributing to the Ethical Society, I'm thinking about, okay, when I bring more money to the table for this, what can we do with it as a community? Right? Where can we go with this? Right? And this year, it's particularly salient. The American Ethical Union has passed a resolution on repairing the harm of racism. Right? This is a huge, wonderful opportunity for ethical societies to get more engaged with the community around us and to start inching the world towards a more fair place. By getting more engaged, by understanding ourselves, by engaging with communities that are pushing hard to have more equity, and by direct support for the groups. So with that in mind, for instance, oftentimes people give for like disasters and things like that, or because they've been hit up by an organization. So like Red Cross, for instance, collects a lot of money. And the thing about a lot of the large organizations that are collecting money is the lion's share of money never quite reaches the targets, right? Because the infrastructure of the organization takes a fair amount. In other words, it takes money to raise money, kind of thing. So that takes quite a lot. And then the very infrastructure for getting the money to the ground is expensive too. Right? Because a lot of times these organizations are bringing their people overseas, right, and paying with the kind of current this country rates and putting them up in places, et cetera, et cetera. So it winds up being a pretty expensive proposition. So my inclination is to, when I give to organizations, look for organizations that have a low cost to them, which is why I tend to get to Foundation Beyond Belief. Anyone know Foundation Beyond Belief? They are a humanist organization dedicated to disaster relief and other kind of direct giving, and are getting a little bit more into some social justice work, but for the most part they like to respond to disasters and that sort of thing. They are humanists. The Ethical Society is actually a partner in that organization, as is the American Ethical Union. So that's a place, and they happen to be based in Texas in part. So recently for the hurricane, a number of societies were giving to Foundation Beyond Belief. There's also more grassroots kind of organizations that we can contribute to that can have a really direct impact. So one of the groups I've been working with recently is Hip Hop Humanism. Hip Hop Humanism is a loosely organized collection of people in North Carolina and Delaware who are looking to find ways to interact with their communities, and particularly communities of color, in ways that help people have a good life and avoid catastrophe. So the one project I did invest in so far was a Kid's Way Out is the name of the overall program, and the investment was in a fishing tournament. And so in Wilmington, Delaware, it turns out they have a very high crime rate, very high poverty right now, lots of issues with infrastructure and not having enough money for schools and all kinds of things. And the person who's organizing this says, you know, I've been away from my community for 12 years. I come back and it's just so desperate right now. We really need more people to step up to do things to help our kids have a more positive experience in life and get to be doing more things that will be helpful for them. So the fishing tournament was a way to gather families together at the riverside and to let kids fish in the river. You know, it was catch and release. The other thing about Wilmington is it's not the least polluted area of the universe, so you really don't want to eat what you pull out of there. But the children really benefited from being together with their families and doing something that was exciting to them. For all these kids, it was the first time they'd ever had a fish on a hook. And they were just so thrilled. And it was just a nice, wonderful experience for all the folks that turned out. And for me, as a contributor, I knew that every dollar that I put into that was going right there. And I could see the result there. Now, was that being generous? I don't know. It was being helpful. Right? So we can be helpful even, when we don't quite cross the threshold into being wildly generous. So looking at this in three different areas to give money. So we got the one which is kind of your institution that you're part of, your congregation. Another is organizations that do good work that you would support and that you think if you put money into that it will be helpful. And the third is to look for avenues closer to home, or closer to the actual event, where you can have a kind of an outside helpful impact addressing with people. However, it needs to begin, I think, with a heartfelt conversation with ourselves about what our giving plan is really going to be. And I think people who see themselves giving generously, by the way, typically feel better about themselves, are healthier, and live longer. So I do encourage you to put some time and energy into this, just for yourselves. Right? It's just to make your lives better. But it also is the case that we're tricky psychologically, right? We like to fool ourselves. Maybe we don't like to fool ourselves, but we do fool ourselves all the time. So we'll convince ourselves that we don't have enough. We'll convince ourselves that it'll be too painful to do this. We'll convince ourselves that we'll do it sometime later, all those kind of things. I encourage you to put your time and energy into the conversation with yourself right away. Figure out what is the percentage of your income that you think would be a fair way to look at your giving as a total. And once you kind of come to terms with that, think about, okay, if that's the amount, how would you apportion that amount in ways that make sense to you and that you think will be effective in this world that we're in? And then make it so. Personally, I think the most The easiest way to do this, actually, is to set things up as a monthly disbursement so that it just kind of comes out of your accounts without you being aware of it again. Because, quite frankly, every time you have the conversation, you have the opportunity to talk yourself out of doing something good. And it's better to talk ourselves into it when we can. That's it.